I'm really pleased to introduce Dr. Laura Noakes, who's just completed her PhD and successfully gone through the Viva process, which can be quite grueling, but it sounds like she came through it with shining colours. So that's fantastic. So well done, Laura. So very pleased to introduce my colleague, Laura Noakes, who is our research assistant at the Devil's Porridge Museum. So she's known to quite a few of you already because of the excellent research project that she's taken the lead on, researching as many of the 30,000 workers of H and Factory Gretna as possible. But before she totally immersed herself in that and in H and Factory Gretna and the wonderful story of the Devil's Porridge Museum that we share, she was involved in doing a PhD on two remarkable women, and that's who she's going to be speaking to us about tonight. So I'm going to start sharing my screen, Laura, and hand over to you whenever you're ready. This is just my little plug about talks that we've got coming up. I think quite a few of them are quite close to being sold out already. So we've got the Great War Huts, an accidental heritage project, one looking at munitions workers' clothing in August, one looking at a parish in Carlisle in September the 20th. On October the 11th, a really interesting look at a female spy in World War I, Stan Harding. And then on November the 22nd, we've got firefighting at HO Factory Gretna. So if you'd like to book for any of those, just pop to Eventbrite, search Devil's Porridge Museum and get your ticket organised. Laura, whenever you're ready, I'll hand over to you to look at the extraordinary lives of Elsie, Bowerman and Chrystal Macmillan, barristers and feminists.
Thank you very much, Judith. Yes, so as Judith said, I've done a PhD on these two women, and I thankfully passed my Viva last week. And these two women were both barristers and feminists, but they approached both of those roles in really different ways. So next slide, please, Judith. So this is just like a brief overview of their lives. As you can see, Elsie was a suffragette. She survived the sinking of the Titanic. She was in Serbia during World War I. She was an election agent, barrister, and all of that kind of twined together in her conservative feminist politics that she kind of used throughout her activism. And Elsie is the one wearing a rather fetching hat down on the left, and then Chrystal is the other woman that I looked at for my PhD, and she was a suffragist. She was the first woman to graduate with a science degree from the University of Edinburgh, and unlike Elsie, who was very, very pro like patriotic and pro World War I, Chrystal was actually a pacifist during the war, and as well as being a barrister after the war. So this is just kind of like a brief overview of both of their lives, and I'm going to go into more detail now. Next slide, please, Judith. So both Elsie and Chrystal were born in the Victorian era to tenuously middle-class families. And I say middle class that was tenuous, not because they weren't prosperous, both of them were very prosperous, but because their middle classness was quite new. So Chrystal's father was involved in the tea trade, and he'd grown from office boy all the way up to the top of the company. And Elsie's mother actually met her father whilst working as a draper's assistant. And I think this influenced them in quite a lot of ways. It's that whole idea of sort of social responsibility and sort of giving back to the community in terms. So both parents were progressive in terms of girls' education, and at the time for middle class girls, education was largely ornamental, or had been. At this time, there was a kind of dominant domestic ideology that ruled sort of the middle class in Britain, and that dominant ideology sort of thought of men as having been in the sphere of the outside, the world of work and the world of politics, and the kind of tough, the tough and rumble, the rough and tumble of those worlds, whereas women were considered to be the sphere of the household, sort of domestic goddesses almost. And for a long time, girls' education reflected this. Girls were educated to be good wives, rather than educated for a career or a role in their own rights. However, by this time, organised feminism had begun to take form. And one of the fronts that these feminists were arguing about was the front of girls' education. They should be educated just like their brothers. So Chrystal and Elsie really benefited from this. They fully sort of experienced this kind of education that taught them politics and languages and the ideas of citizenship that girls maybe 50 years before wouldn't have got. They also had very strong political role models in their fathers. So Chrystal's dad was quite a prominent local liberal, and he was very much in favour of education and actually spoke about the importance of girls' schools. Elsie's dad was also a liberal and was very, very prominent politically in the local community. Despite this sort of very much a progressive environment to be brought up in, both girls also knew from an early age that their gender would disadvantage them. So both Chrystal's mum is very much invisible in the historical record. She had 7 children, and she was very much, very invisible. You can't really see, she didn't have a public persona. She wasn't in the newspapers like Chrystal's dad. And Elsie's mum was very much a kind of quite a strong woman, because Elsie's dad died when Elsie was 5. So Elsie's mum had to raise her and manage all of these businesses, whilst also sort of in the back of her mind, she was a working woman when she met Elsie's dad. So she was the middle classness of that tenuousness of middle classness is really prominent there. And I think this again influenced their politics, because both were determined not to or to eradicate the gendered barriers that they struggled with. So both Chrystal and Elsie, pretty unusually for the time, also attended university. Elsie studied for the medieval and modern languages tripos at Girton College, although women weren't actually awarded degrees at the University of Cambridge until the 1940s. They were allowed to study at Girton College, and Chrystal was actually the first woman science graduate at the University of Edinburgh. And here the pictures that I've got on the screen are Queen Victoria, because Victorian era, and also Wickham Abbey School. What decades are we talking about, Morag was saying? So Elsie, if you go back to the previous slide, I think Elsie was born in 1889 and 1872. So Elsie's is 20 years younger than Chrystal, but this was sort of turn of the century. Chrystal graduated from Edinburgh in 1896, and Elsie was at Girton College, Cambridge from 1908 to 1911. So very much in that turn of the century, first decade of the 20th century. Next slide, please. And the next slide, please. So central to Elsie and Chrystal's political development was the idea of women's suffrage, and women's suffrage was a very hot political issue at the time and had been for the preceding 20 or 30 years. So I don't know how much you guys know about the suffrage movement, so I'm going to do a sort of brief overview, and this doesn't really capture the complexities of the suffrage movement, but broadly speaking, we talk about suffragists and suffragettes, and I put verses there because I always feel like in like documentaries and books, I always feel like they always pump them up like they're almost having a boxing match or something like that, but actually it was more complicated than that. So the suffragists were around for a very long time before the suffragettes came into the picture. So they were members of the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, or the NUWSS, which was founded in 1897 by this lady, who is called Millicent Fawcett. So the NUWSS used non-militant legal tactics. They wrote letters to MPs. They had at homes, which was when they spoke about suffrage and about other issues affecting women, to interested parties. They went on peaceful processions processions throughout London and across the country. And also they were really numerically large. So by 1914, it had 100,000 members, which is just incredible. So the suffragists were very long standing. However, in 1903, the suffragettes, or the Women's Social and Political Union, came along, and this movement was headed by the Pankhurst family. And this picture of these three ladies you can see is Emmeline Pankhurst, and in the middle is her daughter Chrystal Pankhurst, who has a big role in Elsie's story. And then on the right is Sylvia Pankhurst. So WSPU is probably what comes to mind when we think about suffrage and the suffragettes. They believed in deeds, not words. And although they started sort of using similar tactics to the suffragists, they soon descended into arson and breaking windows and stunts to get media attention and to their cause, and sort of ask for the vote in this very sort of you can't turn away way. So they were very much smaller than the NUWSS, and even smaller within those organisations were those women who we know a lot about, who were going to jail and being force-fed and doing all of these sort of attention-grabbing acts. Next slide, please. So Elsie was a suffragette, which is interesting because she was a suffragette at the time where she was also a student at Girton College in Cambridge. And I don't know whether you guys can see, I've circled Elsie there in her class at Girton College. And maybe because she was at Girton and there was a lot of conduct rules at the time for women at university. Obviously there'd been a fight in itself for women to be admitted to universities to study, so they were expected to behave in certain ways, and permitting or taking part in militant acts in the way that the WSPU members did wasn't one of those ways. So there isn't actually any evidence of Elsie taking part in militant activities. I prefer to think of her as she thought militantly, and her activism at this time was really informal. She was militant in belief, and you can see on this side, on this picture on the side, this is the letter Elsie wrote to her mother, Edith, who was also a committed suffragette. And as you can see at the top, she's got a little Votes for Women stamp that she's put on there. And Elsie also made sure to wear a Votes for Women badge when she was in her lectures, prominently on display. And her activism at this point was very much grassroots. She actually goes away to France in 1910, and while she's away, she sends letters back to her mother, and they're full of anecdotes of, oh, I met this Scottish girl and I gave her Votes for Women because she hasn't heard about the cause yet, or I met this old lady who was a liberal and she was laid up with rheumatism, so she literally couldn't move, and what else she did was go and give her a copy of the Votes for Women magazine, so she had to read it, basically. So this very informal beginning of activism gradually developed throughout her university years, and she actually built up to becoming a WSPU district organizer for Eastbourne. And these district organizers sort of did what they said on the tin, really. They organized their activities and supporters within that district. They put on at homes, they put on meetings, they got people in from London to do talks. But although Elsie wasn't actually involved in militancy at the time, her mother was. Next slide, please. So Black Friday, when we think about Black Friday today, we think about that pre-Christmas shopping day, which is very Americanized. But Black Friday was this mythologized event in suffrage history. And this is the front page of the Daily Mirror on the day or a couple of days after the event. And as you can see here, there are policemen standing over a woman on the floor. And basically what led up to this event was that the suffragettes actually said they'd agreed not to do any militancy for much of that, should be 1910 rather than 1911, because there was this bill called the Conciliation Bill going through Parliament. And basically what the suffragettes agreed to was they'd stop militancy if the Conciliation Bill would be allowed to pass. So there was lots of working together for suffragists and suffragettes in order to get this bill passed, and this bill would give some women the vote. However, on this day, on November the 18th, it became clear that the government was not going to allow any more time to the Conciliation Bill. So there was no way this bill was going to pass in that parliamentary session, and women weren't going to get the vote. So they'd spent this entire year not doing militancy because they thought maybe we'll get the vote at the end of it. And then the government sort of pulled the rug out from under them, basically. So they were absolutely furious. They marched on Parliamentary Square, and they were ruthlessly treated by police. I think this march went on for about 6 hours, and many injuries occurred. There were even sexual assaults alleged to have happened, and one woman even died. And many in the WSPU believed that her death was due to her treatment on Black Friday. And Elsie's mother, Edith Bowman Shipman, because she'd remarried at this time, was actually present on that day. And I think I've got a quote from her. So she told Antonia Rayburn, who interviewed Edith for her book, that it was her intention to go to 10 Downing Street or die in the attempt. And in response, a nearby policeman gave her a blow on the head. He caught me by the hair and, flinging me aside, said, "Die then." I found afterwards that so much force had been used, my hairpins were bent double in my hair, and my sealskin coat was torn to ribbons. So really that quote just illustrates just how much, how devoted the suffragettes were to the cause, that they were willing to risk physical injury and confrontations with police. And Elsie was, of course, very worried about her mother. Her mother wasn't elderly by any stretch of the imagination at this point, but all they had was each other. So she wrote back to her mother that it is sickening that this endless fighting has to go on. I hope you won't go on any more raids. I think you've done your share for the week. So she was really quite concerned about the violence sort of melted out to the suffragettes, I mean, in particular her mother. And this event in particular sort of really sums up the intensity of the suffragette movement at this time. And again, just how much the suffrage activists within the WSPU believed in it. Next slide, please. So this is a picture of the Titanic, the famous Titanic, and Elsie has a knack, had a knack, I should say, of being at almost every interesting event you could think of throughout her life, and one of these was the Titanic. So they were on the Titanic, they were first class passengers, and they were traveling to North America and Canada to travel and visit family there. So Elsie survived the sinking of the Titanic, and she escaped in the vessel in lifeboat 6 alongside the famous unsinkable Molly Brown, and actually the ship's lookout, who had first spotted the iceberg. And something that isn't strictly history because it's fiction, but in the film The Titanic with Kate Winslet, Kate Winslet's character is in lifeboat 6. So yeah, not really history, but still an interesting fact. And actually, when this was reported in the press and in the suffrage press, Elsie and her mother were initially reported missing, and they thought that she had died. However, they then celebrated her escape from the ship and identified both of them as very enthusiastic workers in the cause. So this just again shows just how well known Elsie was known at that time. She was a survivor of the Titanic and immediately identified as a suffrage supporter. Next slide, please. Chrystal's approach to suffragism was a little bit more calm, I would say. So Chrystal was a well-known executive committee member of the NUWSS, so the women's the suffragists, and she was well known in suffrage circles for her attempt as an Edinburgh University graduate to vote for the MP who represented the university seat, and this was in 1908, so well before women were granted the vote. And during this time, so from the time that she graduated from the University of Edinburgh 1896 to the time of war breaking out in 1914, suffrage activism was Macmillan's main focus. She travelled widely in an attempt to further campaign. She travelled all over the UK and abroad. Next slide, please. So this photo here is Chrystal is on your right, and she's with the fellow graduates who took this case to the House of Lords. So basically, the House of Lords case revolved around the idea that because these women had graduated from Scottish universities, they already had the parliamentary vote. And at this point in time, certain universities had MPs to represent them, and members of the universities were allowed to vote for their university MP. So in 1892, after women were allowed to graduate from the universities of Edinburgh, Aberdeen, and St Andrews, they argued that they'd fulfilled the requirements. They were members of the universities, therefore they were entitled to vote for their MP. So they first took this up locally, and then the case went all the way to the House of Lords Judicial Committee in London. And this was a major suffrage event. Cases like this had been held in the past. However, what was different about this case was that Chrystal Macmillan was actually going to speak in the House of Lords. She was going to plead her case in person, and not only did this prove that women were intelligent enough to argue a legally complex case, but it also showed that women were public actors for the first time. And at the time, of course, women couldn't vote, they couldn't become lawyers, and they were excluded from many professions. So it was just a bit of a sort of an event. It showed that they were just as capable as their male counterparts. So I'm just going to read, I've got some quotes on my page. So yeah, what the women were referred to as modern Portias and Scottish Portias in the press. Portia obviously being a reference to the William Shakespeare's play. And they were talked about relentlessly. Their outfits they were wearing were talked about, how they did their hair, their hats, their voices, and how it sounded so different to the male barristers' voices. And a lot of press focused on how it must have been the first time since Queen Victoria was spoke in the House of Lords that a woman's voice had been heard there. Despite this, and despite being praised by both the judges and by commentators in the press, the women lost their case. So their lordships concluded that persons, the word persons, didn't include women. And this was a pretty much expected outcome. There had been some of these persons cases in the past, and basically they were using an old statute which said blah 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 blah, this person can vote if he fulfills this requirement. And the women were saying, well, we're persons, we can vote. But obviously at the time that statute was made, the legislators didn't consider women persons. So this was basically what the judiciary agreed with. They said they didn't consider women were persons when they made this law, therefore we're not going to enfranchise women. And when Chrystal heard the outcome of the case, she said quite sagely that we live to fight another day. Next slide, please. So Chrystal, between 1909 and the outbreak of war in 1914, Chrystal spoke on 80 occasions in the UK. She spoke at public meetings, she spoke at homes, she addressed huge crowds, she went to mass demonstrations as an invited speaker. She appeared in London, Orkney, Cardiff, Edinburgh, all over the UK. And she was also involved in international suffrage campaigns. So she traveled over to Toronto, and she was going to all of these different conferences in Stockholm and Budapest. And she wrote a book in collaboration with 2 other international suffrage campaigners. And so from this kind of me rambling about how much work she did, you can just see she was so renowned. She spoke and was well thought of and was very much a prominent person in British feminism and within the British suffrage campaign. Next slide, please. So, World War I broke out in August 1914. It's quite a common misconception that suffrage activities just stopped throughout the war. But instead, I see it as a kind of, they pivoted towards a new international political situation that was unprecedented at the time. So the NUWSS immediately helped women who had been left unemployed because their industries were completely eradicated by war into alternative paid work. They also helped fund women's hospital units, which cared for injured soldiers. And they also helped with some of the many refugees that came to the UK after the war broke out. And at the end of the war in 1917, when Parliament was considering voting reform, they actually argued, they sort of used women's war work and said, look, we worked for this war too. We did so much. We did a vital role in the war, and that's why women should be enfranchised. And the WSPU actually immediately called a truce with the government. So up until this point, militancy had been escalating and escalating and escalating, and many suffrage activists were in jail at the time that war broke out. So they called this truce and then actually worked in a kind of really about turn. They worked very closely with the government to recruit women into war work. And the Pankhursts in particular became very nationalistic and patriotic. However, both Elsie and Chrystal held really different wartime views, and this was reflected in the work that they chose to do. Next slide, please. So Elsie probably started the war as a WSPU district organiser. However, the one thing that stands out about her war work is her time in the Scottish women's hospitals for women's service. So Elsie was an orderly for the SWH in Serbia. And the Scottish Women's Hospitals was founded by this lady who's not dressed in a nurse's uniform in this image, who was called Dr. Elsie Inglis. And Dr. Inglis was a really prominent doctor and also a prominent suffrage campaigner. In fact, she had actually been one of the Scottish Women's University graduates who had asked for voting rights in 1908 with Chrystal Macmillan. So when Elsie, obviously very much a professional doctor, she was highly trained, approached the War Office to say, look, what can I do to help the war effort? She was actually told, and this, to go home and sit still. And so Dr. Inglis approached other allied countries, and she set up hospitals in France and lots of different units over Europe, and one of these units was in Serbia. So it was unique in 2 senses. Firstly, it was funded by the NUWSS, so it was funded by the suffragists, which again shows just how interconnected both the WSPU and the NUWSS were, because there wasn't a clear cut between suffragists and suffragettes. There was some overlap there. And secondly, the SWH was staffed almost entirely by women. So the conditions in wartime Serbia were absolutely atrocious. So the Serbian army only had 300 doctors, and on top of this, they had an epidemic that ravaged the country. And on top of this, the invading forces were rapidly approaching. So on many occasions, Elsie's unit in Serbia would frequently be so close to the front line that they would hear and see planes, and they'd have to retreat on numerous occasions when the front changed. Next slide, please. So Elsie worked in really terrifying conditions. And here you can actually see, this is a picture from the Women's Library at LSE in London. And this is Elsie's passport, which she used during the war. And Elsie's role as an orderly maybe doesn't seem quite as, not terrifying, but not quite as involved as nursing or doctors, but she really was right in the thick of it. She was transporting very severely injured troops from one hospital to the other. She was making sure, she was assisting nurses with cleaning and helping to treat soldiers, and she was also working alongside pioneering medical professions, so doctors and nurses who hadn't really been taken that seriously because of their gender, but they were demonstrating how capable they were. And there's one particular incident which Elsie refers to in her unpublished memoirs, which happened in October 1916, when she basically took off Indiana Jones style and chased after these wagons which had been disconnected from the hospital's luggage, and tracked them down with another orderly without any money at all, found them and got them back to the main unit. So Elsie very much sees her time in Serbia as this kind of adventure. There are some really jarring quotes from the diary that she wrote at the time, where she'll just sort of say something along the lines, oh, I might actually have a quote here. She describes it as a most thrilling experience. Aeroplane Jill just outside the door, glorious day, but shells didn't hit, enemy escaped. So it's very much an adventure, and it's very jarring to read, because there's this kind of thing about how much fun she's having, and then 2 seconds later she's talking about these horribly injured men. It is clear though that she was very much privy to the suffering of these men. When she went to a trip to the cinema in Russia on her way back from Serbia, she saw the film of the Somme that had been taken, and she thought it was far too horribly realistic. So she was definitely affected by her time in Serbia. And incidentally, and again, another example of Elsie being at the interesting points in history, was that on her way back from Serbia, she was actually in Petrograd and witnessed some of the Russian Revolution happening. Next, please. So Chrystal took a very, very different path to Elsie. And I've titled this slide Pacifist Rebel, because really being a pacifist was a rebellious move during World War I. It was often not very popular, and you can see from sort of the treatment of conscientious objectors and the idea of white feathers being given to people who were maybe not considered doing their part in the war, that there really was a distrust and dislike of those people who were committed pacifists. However, Chrystal didn't really care about this. She was a pacifist, and she was throughout the war, and she actually spent much of her war abroad. So in 1915, she attended the International Congress at The Hague. And you can see here, Chrystal is on the far right in Oslo in 1915. And you'd think it would be difficult to travel during wartime, and it was. And yet Chrystal and her fellow pacifists managed to visit many different countries in an attempt to end hostilities. She was actually only one of 3 women who attended this conference at The Hague, and this conference was an explicitly pacifist conference. And the reason why only 3 women attended, even though 180 women planned to go, was that Winston Churchill, who was then the First Lord of the Admiralty, actually prevented them from going, because these British women were going to meet women from France, women from Germany, and it wasn't seen to be done in war. We were at war with Germany, so the government was very keen to prevent this meeting from happening. So Chrystal was one of 3 women who actually made it to The Hague. And at this Congress in 1915, next slide, please. This is a picture of the Congress in 1915, and I've circled Chrystal with her fellow delegates. It was explicitly feminist, so they had to be members of this Congress, you had to agree with pacifism and suffrage, women's suffrage, basically. And the most prominent resolution that came out of this Congress was proposed by Rosika Schwimmer, and Schwimmer wanted Congress to have delegates who would act as envoys. So they would bring these agreed resolutions to neutral and belligerent countries in person. So she wanted, during wartime, when the whole of Europe was kind of beset with war and there was fighting, she wanted these women to travel about and deliver, ask different countries, both belligerent and neutral, for peace. So Macmillan was the head of one of these delegations, and she actually visited officials in Denmark, Sweden, Norway, and Russia, and interviewed 29 European statesmen. So this was really an incredible achievement because these trips were unofficial, they weren't state sanctioned, and these women were traveling through a continent beset by war. Next slide, please. And although the Congress maybe didn't achieve what it aimed to do, it aimed to end hostilities, it did actually have a profound effect on Woodrow Wilson, who was the president of the USA. So his famous 14-point speech owes much to the principles and the resolutions established in the peace conference at The Hague. And this speech, which was, you can see a picture of him delivering this speech to Congress, he wanted to use these principles for negotiating peace terms at the end of World War I. However, his allied counterparts didn't really agree, and these principles were eroded in the eventual peace terms, the Treaty of Versailles. And in particular, the war guilt clause flew in the face of many of the ideals that Wilson talked about in his speech, and many of the pacifist women who recognised the connections between their resolutions at The Hague and Wilson's aims were absolutely furious that this treaty, the Treaty of Versailles, didn't take into account their ideas. Next slide, please. So, having spent the war as a pacifist and as a war worker respectively, in 1918, the Representation of the People Act was passed. And as you can see here, this is an image of a woman dropping off her ballot in the ballot box. And this act allowed all men over the age of 21, if they were in the armed forces, this age limit was 19 or older, to vote. And they allowed women to vote, providing that they were A, over 30, and B, met certain property requirements. I think it was that they had to live, or they had to own, or their husbands had to own property that was worth £5 in the tax rates, and they were C, university graduates voting in their university constituency. So this political reform tripled the electorate in Great Britain. However, as you can see by sort of how I've told you who could vote and who couldn't vote, this act excluded quite a few people. So although some women could vote, the act was far from equal. In addition to excluding women under 30, the property and education requirements also meant that many working class women didn't have the right to vote. And if you've been to the Devil's Porridge Museum, you know that the women who worked in munitions were very often young, single, working class women. So a lot of them would have actually been excluded and wouldn't have been able to vote in 1918. Next slide, please. So what did this mean for Elsie and Chrystal? Well, for poor Elsie, the 1918 election actually happened 4 days before she reached her 30th birthday. So she would not have been able to vote. She'd spent most of her university education time and extracurricular extra free time campaigning for the vote. And when it actually came, she could not vote in the first ever general election where women could vote. And maybe because she wasn't actually entitled to vote, Elsie decided to become an election agent in the 1918 election. So just to give you a bit of background and context, the WSBU had kind of collapsed by the end of the war. It had been renamed the Women's Party, or WP, and Chrystal Pankhurst was actually standing for election to Parliament. So the Women's Party was a women-only political party that aimed to prepare women for their impending citizenship, and their objectives were very much that of the Pankhurst. They were nationalistic, pro, having severe reparations on the Germans. They were feminist, they were conservative. And so Elsie kind of poured all her energy into helping Chrystal get elected, helping Christabel get elected. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your beliefs, Christabel wasn't actually elected. She lost by a couple of hundred votes. Chrystal's political ideology also sort of went through a change at this time. So the focus on suffrage had often sort of left other reforms to the sidelines. And when partial suffrage was granted in 1918, this actually allowed feminist organisations and feminists to broaden their aims. So Chrystal wanted mothers to be equal joint guardians of children. She wanted equal pay. She wanted married women not to be barred from many professions, because at the time there was a marriage bar in many professions, and that she wanted them to have the right to determine their own nationality. So these ideas were very much quite radical for the time. But again, they set her off on this very sort of feminist, liberal path for the future. Next slide, please. And so far, I haven't actually talked much about women in law. And just to give you a bit of background to both women and also the women's attempts to get into the legal profession, women had actually been attempting to join law, both as solicitors and as barristers, for a number of years. So Morag, Elsie wasn't, if she'd been over 30, she should have been able to vote as a university graduate. Although actually, I'm not sure, because you could technically not graduate from Cambridge. That's a good question. I have to look into that. But because she was under 30, she was automatically disqualified. So no woman, regardless of property or educational qualifications, could vote under 30. So women had been attempting to join law for a number of years before the Sex Disqualification Removal Act 1919 actually finally admitted them. So the first woman who gained a law degree in England was called Elise, and she'd done so in 1888. So it had been quite a few years, and there had been consistent objection from many within the legal profession to women becoming lawyers. And that's not to say that all male lawyers were against women joining the profession, just that there were a lot who were. And these objections were due to a number of reasons. And these are just a selection of the reasons that I find quite interesting. So obviously we've got the women are not persons and therefore could not be public actors, and this reasoning was actually used to stop a lady named Gwyneth Bebb from becoming a solicitor before the war. Another criticism and worry that many male lawyers had were that women's voices were too high-pitched and tinny to be heard across the courtroom. Another criticism or worry was that women were too delicate to hear the horrible details of some cases. Law was not suitable for them because it was very much a masculine endeavour. Women shouldn't hear horrible cases of crimes or cases involving children and family law. There was also a big debate in the legal press about if women became barristers, what would they wear on their heads in court? So women traditionally at this time wore hats in court. Barristers obviously wore their wig. So there was a big old sort of ruckus over whether women were going to wear their hat and then the barrister's wig on top, or the barrister's wig and the hat on top, or something that was like a combination of the two. So because of these objections, it was actually left to Parliament to legislate to allow women to become lawyers, and they did so in this Sex Disqualification Removal Act. So the first woman who qualified as a barrister in England and Wales was Ivy Williams, who you can see here, looking resplendent in her robes and wig. And she was actually called to the bar in 1922. And Bowerman and Macmillan were called 2 years later. And actually, quite interestingly, Ivy never practiced as a barrister. She actually became a legal academic, but she was the first woman called, first woman to be qualified as a barrister. Next slide, please. So here is Elsie, dressed in her barrister's robes and wig. And Elsie was always keen in every letter after she became a barrister. Yeah, Juliet, you're right. They could only vote in their university constituency, even if they were a graduate. So Elsie was always keen to emphasize her legal status as a barrister. And she actually said in her memoir that she became a barrister because all of her public political work made her think it would be an advantage to know the law. And she was in her mid-30s at this time that she was called, and very much seen as a feminist. And Enid Rosser, who was a fellow early woman barrister, actually said quite bluntly that she did not achieve much, but was constantly seen about the courts. And that suggests to me that Elsie was probably not getting instructed by clerks a lot. Barristers rely on clerks to give them cases that solicitors will pass on solicitors' cases. And if you weren't getting instructed by clerks, you'd have to hang around the courts and hope that somebody who maybe couldn't afford a solicitor, that you'd be called up to represent them. So Elsie probably didn't build up much of a practice, and she actually only highlights one case in her memoir, which involved the well-known communist activist Harry Pollitt. So Elsie was very much against communism. She was very much a conservative political follower, and in this case, she acted as prosecuting counsel, which it centered around this alleged libel. Pollitt had committed against a man called David Scott. So Scott had lived in Russia for a time, and when he came back from Russia, he was openly critical about the Russian government. And the British communists weren't very happy about this. They considered this counter-revolutionary. And in response, Pollitt wrote in a public publication that Scott lived with a prostitute, he engaged in contraband details and acted as a pimp, and he stole from seamen. So this case was very much a comment on the Russian legal system, on the Russian state. And so when Bowerman won the case and it was decided that Pollitt had defamed Scott, Bowerman was absolutely thrilled. And I think that just illustrates just how political Elsie's lawyering was. She was very much an activist barrister. She used her legal training as a tool to further her activism, and her legal status as a barrister actually made her activism more professional. It gave her authority to speak. Next slide, please. So in tandem to Elsie's being a barrister, she was also involved and co-founded this organisation called the Women's Guild of Empire. And the picture you can see on the screen now is Flora Drummond, and her nickname, which she was also a suffragette, and this nickname originated in the suffragette movement, was the General. And as you can see here, she's in very sort of militaristic outfit. She's got her hat on, she's got her sash. I think the letters on her hat say National WSPU, which was a name adopted by the WSPU for a time. But by this time, the WSPU had floundered. The Women's Party, which was the WSPU's replacement and the party that Christabel Pankhurst stood for in the 1918 election, had floundered. And as such, Elsie and Flora formed this pro-imperial very conservative, anti-fascist feminist organisation called the Women's Guild of Empire. And their motto was peace, unity and concord. They were firmly against industrial action by workers, and they were very, very highly critical of strikes. And Bowerman appears to have been sort of the organisational mastermind behind this organisation. And this organisation wasn't small. It was alleged to have had about 20,000 members, and just like the WSPU, bases or sections across the UK of members. However, there's not much known about the Women's Guild of Empire, actually, and it's something that I'm very interested in finding more out about, because I think it's a fascinating and under-researched area of feminist history. So Bowerman's title was that Deputy Controller of the Guild, and as you can see with Flora Drummond's appearance here and the title Deputy Controller, it ran along the same militaristic lines as the WSPU. And Bowerman was very much involved in organising speeches and writing letters to newspaper editors and organising marches. And she also edited the organ publication, The Bulletin. So while she was working as a barrister, Bowerman spent much of her time really working to build up this feminist organisation. So her political activism never really took a step back. Next slide, please. Chrystal, on the other hand, was very much a prototype human rights lawyer before such things existed. She was a very hard worker. She was never happier than handling a case for the Poor Persons Department. And this was the Poor Persons Department, or doc briefs, were cases where prisoners didn't have enough money to afford a solicitor and a barrister, and it was kind of like a legal aid. So these doc briefs and Poor Persons Department cases, like I mentioned before with Elsie, were given to barristers who were hanging around the court. And again, it's a sign that when a lot of that barristers' cases tend to be doc briefs or Poor Persons Department cases, that they maybe weren't getting instructed by clerks a lot. So Chrystal's, as you can see here, resplendent in her barrister robes again, the fact that she was, that the one anecdote that I found about her practice, her legal practice at the time, revolves around a doc brief, suggests to me that maybe she wasn't getting as many cases as would be required to have a flourishing legal practice. But I think this anecdote really does say a lot. I don't know whether you can see the bottom bit there, but basically a prisoner wished to give a doc brief and was informed in the usual way that if he had the sum of £1, 3 shillings and 6pence, he could choose any counsel in court. His view of them was limited, and he had not taken the prudent precaution, which the more experienced malefactors sometimes adopted, of consulting one of the warders, as they were then called, which counsel he should choose. Scanning the row of heads, he announced after some hesitation, "I'll have the nearest gentleman." Chrystal rose from her seat. And this was all hilarious. "Ho, ho, ho," said Ernie Charles from the bench. "The nearest gentleman is a lady. What are you going to do?" The prisoner gallantly said he would stick to his choice of the nearest. So she defended him and she got him off. So you can see that women barristers were almost seen as a kind of second choice. Like they you didn't want to get a woman barrister, basically, but as you can see, Chrystal got him off. So they weren't all bad, and that's my argument. This was generally down to institutional sexism and the fact that women barristers were new, and because they were new, they were news. Next slide, please. So Chrystal spent most of her post-suffrage activism devoted to the cause of married women's nationality. And basically, this issue revolved around if you married a foreigner, you automatically assumed the nationality of your spouse. So you lost your British nationality. And this was a problem for a lot of reasons. So if you married, say, if you were married to a German in 1913, in 1914, you were considered enemy aliens. You were unable to live in certain areas of the country. You had no choice. Even if you wanted to keep your British nationality, you couldn't. And it also didn't mesh well with other areas of law. So, for example, the Cable Act of 1922 meant that if you married an American, you didn't automatically get American citizenship. So for British women, you'd lose your British citizenship when you married an American, but you didn't gain American citizenship, so you were stateless. And it was also a really complicated area of law because at the time it was national, so English law, international, so it was the interaction between countries, and it was also empirical because at the time the British Empire was about, and therefore there was intersections in those three areas. And although this reform wasn't actually achieved in Macmillan's lifetime, she laid a lot of the groundwork. She consistently talked about how important it was for women to have choice in their nationality. And eventually in 1948, this did happen. The British Nationality Act provided women with that choice. Next slide, please. So why weren't Elsie and Chrystal more successful in law? So obviously women had only just entered law, and there's a lot of focus in the histories on the people who achieved loads, and they are great. They show that women really sort of trailblazed and knocked down barriers. However, Elsie and Chrystal were slightly older than the average barrister. I think the average barrister was in between the age of 20 to 27 in the year 1900. Chrystal was 52 when she was called, and Elsie was in her mid to late 30s. So that could have been a reason why they weren't more successful. Their gender was also very much obviously a reason. Just by virtue of them being women, they were sort of making this political statement of being sort of women barristers. They also didn't slow down on their political activism. In fact, I think for both of them it intensified. Both of them were involved in feminist organisations throughout their time as a barrister. And fourthly, my answer and what I think is that I think they knew they were veterans of this suffrage movement. They knew that women probably weren't going to have an easy time of it in law, and I think they didn't even go into law with what we would consider usual legal ambitions. So people today and people in the past, I guess, if you want to be a barrister, you want to be called to be Queen's Counsel, or you want to maybe build up a really successful practice and eventually become a judge. However, I think Chrystal and Elsie were under no illusions that this was very nearly impossible for them to achieve. And instead, I think what they wanted to do was trailblaze. They wanted to just knock down barriers by just being there. And it didn't matter that they weren't quote unquote successful. Next slide, please. So we're coming to the end of it, I promise. Macmillan's was actually a parliamentary candidate for the Liberal Party in 1935. And even at this relatively early date, she was warning against the dangers of Adolf Hitler. She was obviously standing on a pro-feminist political platform and was very pro-peace. And this was almost an emulation. Many barristers, male barristers I'm speaking about, had gone on to become MPs in the past. So she was almost kind of subverting that in a way by doing it as a woman and as a feminist. However, unfortunately, she came third in the Edinburgh North election and actually lost her election deposit. However, this isn't an indictment on her policies or her position as a candidate. At the time, the Liberal Party were very much in decline. It was very difficult for a woman of any political party to get elected. And Chrystal was standing on a platform which wasn't really in tune with the mood of the time, I would say. And because of this, and maybe because of this, because she focused on being a parliamentary candidate, there was a reduction in her activism. However, she was also in declining health. She had to cancel a conference that she was leading, that she was the president at, in 1937, and in May she had her leg amputated. So in September of 1937 she actually passed away in a nursing home in Edinburgh, and she was 65 years old. Next slide, please. So Bowerman was 20 years younger than Chrystal, as I have mentioned, and she actually spent the war working in a number of different organisations that were essential to the war effort. And one of these was the Women's Voluntary Service, which was a really important wartime organisation and the largest women's organisation in British history. And it became a kind of support network for the young, the old, the displaced during wartime. And Elsie, you can see in the bottom photo here, Elsie is the lady wearing a pearl necklace, and she's sitting next to Lady Reading, who was the founder. And Lady Reading herself says when Elsie is leaving the WVS that it's ridiculous for me to thank you because we've been in the job together since the start. And I think that just shows how important Elsie was to the formation and the success of this organisation. And after she left the Women's Voluntary Service in 1940, she then joined the Ministry of Information for a bit, and then she focused in on the BBC's Overseas Service, where she worked around the dissemination of propaganda information directed towards the US. She was basically working on programming that was, the aim was to try and get the US to enter the war on the Allied side. Next slide, please. And then after the war, again, Elsie just appears to pop up in almost every sort of, well, not every, but in many major events during the 20th century. She actually was at the very first Commission on the Status of Women for the UN, or the United Nations. Elsie was a secretary, and this here is a picture from that very first commission. And this was a perfect role for Elsie, because this commission basically promoted the eradication of legal inequality between genders and also focused on women's empowerment. And obviously Elsie had this legal background, but she also had a background in feminist activism that focused on making women into responsible citizens. And so Elsie was the secretary at the UN in 1947. Next slide, please. So what is these two women's legacy? So both women were pioneers and trailblazers, and having read their letters and their articles over 3.5 years of my PhD, I've really grown to like both of them. I find that their personalities are both just infectious. And I think they also offer an important part of the story. They offer a different perspective to the Votes for Women campaign. Elsie was very much a grassroots campaigner. She wasn't involved in these kind of these demonstrations and these violent conflicts between police and suffragettes. She took a different approach, and they also complicate our understanding of women professionals. So both actually grew up in the Victorian era, where a women professional was an oddity, but both women approached both law and their activism as a professional endeavour. And they were also not that successful as barristers. And although it's so important to hear about barristers like Helena Normanton and Rose Helberon, who broke down barriers and were the first women to achieve this and become this, it's also really important that we know about women who maybe didn't achieve that. And here is a very cheesy photo of me that I asked a poor lady to take, and it's in Parliamentary Square, and it's a statue of Millicent Fawcett, who was the leader of the suffragists. And actually you can just about see next to my shoulder on the plinth, there are little photos of other women activists, and Chrystal Macmillan's photo is on that plinth. And Elsie's isn't, because she was a suffragette, but I think that just shows that their legacy is still important today. They really were extraordinary. They blazed a path for a profession that women hadn't really been in for very long. And on top of that, they continually fought for women and for feminist reforms throughout their lives. Next slide, please. So thank you for listening. And do you have any questions?
That's just me clapping. Well done, Laura. That was great. So I'll just stop sharing my slides and give you a round of applause on behalf of everyone. Thank you very much for sharing that. That was fascinating. I'm glad that they were really ironing out the important issues with hats first or wigs.
Yeah.
It's amazing what occupies people's minds and time when they're looking for excuses not to give.
Oh, definitely.
And it felt like a bit of an episode of Doctor Who there, or the X-Files or something, where she keeps popping up in all these places. It's like she's on the Titanic, she's there. Was she also in Dallas in the bookstore?
Yes.
She's sort of popping up everywhere. That's fantastic. So it was a really interesting talk from my perspective. I really enjoyed hearing about it. And I think, as you say, it's so important to not, one of the aims surely of equality is that everyone has the right just to be, and not have to be a pioneering woman, a strong woman, a mega successful woman. It's actually, I was just myself. And to have that diversity, and just to show that people were different opinions, different attitudes, not always some figurehead or having to be that. That's really, really good. So I'll open it up to the questions. I can see people putting a few comments in, and I think you answered a couple as you went on about the when people have the right to vote or not to vote, and so on. So if anyone does have any other questions, you're very welcome to unmute yourself. Or you can put them into the chat.
Sorry, please.
Go ahead, Laura.
I think Karen mentioned, so there's a science building at the University of Edinburgh named after Chrystal. Is there anything similar for Elsie? Elsie has got a blue plaque at the house she lives, I think in Eastbourne or St Leonard's, but other than that, interestingly, when I started researching, I actually found Elsie in a footnote. She was just a footnote of something, and if you Google her name, or if you Googled her name a couple of years ago, the only things that popped up were the fact that she'd survived the Titanic. And so I think again, it's that thing of sort of giving these women agency and like showing what they did rather than what they happened to be on a ship that sunk, is really important. But I'd love to see something more for Elsie in the future.
I wanted to ask you, Laura, how did you decide to research these two people? Were they a point given to you, or was it something you discovered them?
So I started my PhD, and I knew that I wanted to do something on the links between law and the suffrage movement, because Christabel Pankhurst, who was the famous suffragette, actually had a law degree. She graduated from the University of Manchester. So I knew that there was links there, and I also knew that suffragettes in particular and suffragists often co-opted the law to kind of further their aims. So I started with 4 women, and Chrystal was one of them, but Elsie wasn't. And I was just happened to read, I was reading a book on suffrage, and I found Elsie in a footnote, and she said that it said that she became a barrister, and I thought, wow. And then I realized that she had all of her letters sort of saved in an archive repository at the LSIE, and she was just it hadn't been researched at all, apart from a couple of articles on Titanic websites and stuff like that. So I kind of fell into it, but yeah.
And so Leslie says Elsie's wiki page could do with a bit of love. So maybe
yes, I do need. Yeah, it does need a bit of love. I agree.
So that is something, if you aren't aware, we're actually currently working on a project at the Devil's Porridge Museum to help increase the representation of women on Wikipedia. So that's something we are currently working on. So Morag said, thank you for emphasising the importance of less groundbreaking pioneer. Oh, hang on, I think I missed one, sorry, as well. Oh yeah, sorry, Joyce said, thank you, very interesting to hear about these women who are just battling on. Also good to hear about a woman's view of historical events, for example World War One. And it's good to hear different people's perspectives as well, and that it's always worth remembering that there wasn't a uniform view of World War One at all. Thank you for more access. Thank you for emphasizing the importance of the less groundbreaking pioneer. Why do you think relatively little attention has been paid to the local government and education board franchise of 1872? It was also massively important, but it's also almost unknown. I was thinking that too. I couldn't remember the name of the act. It's not something I've ever, but I was thinking about, you know, that people could vote in certain things, couldn't they? But yeah, so you take that one, Laura.
Yeah, it's the same as the Sex Disqualification Removal Act of 1919. I think all this attention, because the suffrage campaign was so massive at the time, although feminists had different other kind of platforms on which they wanted to reform, the fact that it was such a kind of focus, laser focus almost, that it sent other kind of important acts like that one and the Sex Disqualification Removal Act to kind of the wayside. And I think getting those acts, like talking about them and sort of making more people aware of how important other acts other than parliamentary suffrage was, is so important, because it just shows that it wasn't this kind of like suffrage, bang, women are equal. It shows the complexities, and it also shows the kind of chipping away. That's what I like to think of the suffrage campaign and first wave feminism, is it is very much a chipping away and sort of women reforming girls' education and girls being educated like their brothers, and then women being able to go into universities. And it's just a tiny little kind of chip away that kind of led to things becoming more equal.
I think people love a simple formula, don't they? This
course,
plus
yeah,
this led to this, you know, so it's like war plus suffragettes led to women's rights, and now we're all happy and fine. And in the same way, it's sort of like, you know, Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks led to, you know,
yes,
the emancipation of Black people or equal rights, and now everything's fine. It's sort of, it's a nice simplistic, and now we'll have a holiday for it, and
yeah,
even better, or a commemorative stamp or something.
yeah.
That just makes it all nice and neatly tied up in a bow, whereas the complexity of it's much more. C. Evans, Carol, is asking, is your PhD published anywhere? I don't think it is yet, is it?
It's not yet, but hopefully it will be soon.
Yeah, so you literally just got your Viva approved the other day, didn't you? So I imagine it will be on available, and we'll make sure that we make it well known through the Devil's Porridge channels, so you can access it. This week there was a live stream of the CESAW, which I don't know what that is.
CEDAW, sorry.
Oh, sorry, Karen. What is that? Sorry.
For the elimination of all discrimination against women. So it's, if you look up cedaw.com, I think it is, I'll find the link and put it in. And it's very interesting because it's women giving evidence to a People's Tribunal, and it's all women barristers that are running it. I watched a little bit of it this morning, and they are referring back to earlier women that led legal changes. I mean, they're looking at what the rights, why has the UK not put this? Thank you, Leslie. Why have they not put, United Nations Convention was agreed by Mrs. Thatcher way back 40 years ago, and it's not been made into UK law. So some of the things that Elsie in particular were probably discussing at United Nations are still being discussed to this day.
It's so interesting to see because even though both of the women were so different, there were so many parallels between them. Like Chrystal was advocating for something that then in 1948, I think the nationality question was discussed at the first ever UN Commission. And it's very much, you can see kind of reflections of past feminist campaigns all the time kind of going forward, which is very interesting.
Well, I know you were at the Women's History Network conference a while ago, Laura. There was a group who reenacted that the meeting that they had in Switzerland, is the one that she went to. Well, I think it was Switzerland, wasn't it? And they made a film about it. Different women campaigners from today played different women campaigners in the past, and they got the train all the way out there like they would have done. It was fantastic.
I think I've seen a bit of that. Yeah, it's just incredible, things like that. It's such an important part, and again, it's like you said, it just shows the complexity of World War I history and all of that.
And they were making that big thing, like if the women, if the mothers were in charge of the fighting,
Yes.
this wouldn't take place, which again is a huge oversimplification, but it's
Yes.
a very compelling sort of argument that the women's voices should be more loudly heard.
That interesting. Oh, sorry.
Go on, you go ahead.
That was really interesting. Both Chrystal and Elsie co-opted things like Chrystal did a lot of like with the mothers of soldiers, they're giving their children, like women are the kind of creators of everything, and Elsie was very much like we women housewives don't want strikes, that kind of thing. Whereas they were using all of these kind of terminology and these allusions whilst they were both single professional women who weren't mothers, they were very much sort of tapping into the kind of ideology of the moment to sort of get the best answer, get people on their side more, which was interesting.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's always interesting when anyone speaks for all mothers, all housewives, all women, as if people don't have their own brains. So Morag said yes, there were many smaller pioneers 50 years earlier. More research needed on the 1872 Act. Here. So Leslie said most of the women who campaigned for the vote did it so that they could campaign for other women's rights. Yeah, absolutely. It was sort of the gateway, wasn't it, to other things. And Karen, sorry, you said CEDAW, People's Tribunal. Thank you, Karen. And then Leslie's put in a link to that. So that's fascinating. Thank you very much for that. So does anybody have any other questions or comments for Laura? I certainly think it's been a really interesting.
I would love to ask a question.
Go ahead, Robin.
Yeah. Now, when the House of Lords was deciding not to give the girls at Edinburgh University the vote, it said that women aren't a person. What are they then?
Well, exactly. That was one of the many. There were lots of what they were called person cases throughout the latter half of the 19th century and the 20th century, where basically old statutes would refer to persons, but obviously back in the 16th, 17th century, the legislators, the politicians weren't thinking that women were persons. They were referring to persons as men only. So a lot of the cases where women said, I want to vote, I am a person, turned on this question, are women persons? And it was decided by judges over the course of many cases that women weren't persons in like the public sense. They weren't public actors, and therefore they weren't persons, which obviously to our ears sounds absolutely ludicrous, but it was a kind of quite an established principle by that point. They basically were doing it so that women weren't accidentally enfranchised. If they just said, oh yeah, women are persons, then they would have accidentally enfranchised like the women graduates of Scottish universities, which were a ridiculously tiny kind of minority. And that would have then opened the floodgates to all women being enfranchised. So they were really trying to kind of stem that possibility.
So a woman then was a possession. I have 6 horses, 3 cows, and a woman.
Yeah. And up until I think it was the 1870s, where women were just property. They were just chattels of their husbands.
Yeah.
So it really wasn't that much of a jump.
Doesn't say much for the House of Lords, does it?
Leslie said in the comments, yeah, it's very similar to people of colour in the US and the way in which they were described in the cases there, where they had to, before you could do anything legally, you had to prove that you existed legally first.
Yeah.
If you see what I mean. So, but then it's just the rigging of the system, isn't there? If the semantics of who decides you're a person. You're not a person in the public sphere, but you can't be a person in the public sphere until you prove that you're a person in the public sphere to gain the rights to be a person in the public sphere. So it's quite a contradictory thing, but that's because the system was kind of rigged. And women were women not legally like children, says Morag. They
were lumped in with lunatics and criminals, I think, which really annoyed the suffragists, obviously. And yet Karen's correctly pointed out that there was a census protest in 1911, and actually Elsie's mother Edith doesn't appear on the census, so maybe there were women hiding in attics and like going away from home on the night the census was taken to avoid being taken by the census.
Yeah, Laura, you were having trouble at the start sort of describing the differentiation between the suffragettes and the suffragees. The difference is one were terrorists and the other ones weren't.
That's a personal opinion.
Well, there are a lot of I do to some extent agree, because they were at the end, when they were really getting into, like, we were getting into 1913, 1914, they were committing arson, they were putting acid in post boxes, they were planting bombs, and they did have, to be fair to them, they did have a sort of maxim of they never wanted to hurt a living creature. However, because the suffragette the WSPU weren't very organized, it was very much a kind of family run business, and kind of mavericks jumped off, like Emily Wilding Davison sort of did sort of committed acts, and then that kind of sparked more people doing other things. It was very much a maxim that I think they were lucky not to have broken. I think it is very lucky that nobody died. Yeah, and as Leslie said, one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. But it's very interesting. I see a lot of people sort of saying that they were terrorists.
Did one of them not to whip to Winston Churchill one time?
Oh,
yeah.
That was on a train carriage. They did that. Yeah, they did lots of chained themselves.
Plotted to kidnap Randolph Churchill as well, didn't they? There was
they set fire to a theatre in Ireland. They did burnt down they burnt down a whole unfurnished house, I think, of one politician.
Oh yeah, Leslie's absolutely right. Churchill was
very rude.
I mean, Churchill was rude about an awful lot of people. I know now he's got an incredibly positive reputation. Had he died in 1938, I don't think his reputation would have been so positive. I think the Second World War really saved him from himself, potentially, because of the things he said about Gandhi weren't very polite or pleasant either. And he was quite active in Black Friday as well, wasn't he?
Black Friday was very much, he was I can't remember what political position he had at the time, but he was the one who directed the police to kind of be as violent as possible towards the women.
I guess again it comes down to the whole terrorist freedom fighter sort of thing. I mean, I guess that, you know, you're allowed to do things in war that would be classed as terrorism if the government says it's okay to do it, and then if the government says you're not allowed to do it, you know, and you think the government's in the wrong, then you're classed as a terrorist, I guess. I suppose the women would argue that some of the things that took place in World War I were nothing but acts of terrorism, for which people got medals and bravery awards and things. So we've got some more questions. Sorry, go ahead.
So I was going to say, Judith, if you read the Terrorism Act and the definition of a terrorist, the suffragettes fit the definition perfectly.
Yeah,
they really do.
I'm sure they will. My point was maybe that the people who write the laws are maybe the people who frame the discussion and decide on, you know, you can write the law.
Maybe.
So let's have a look what we're saying. Best wishes on your award of your doctorate. That's very kind of you. Thank you. How do you think they would have defined a woman? Joan asks. I think it was the discussion we were having a little while ago.
I think, I mean, it's very much sort of, you've got to put them in their historical context. I think for them, especially first wave feminists, it was all about the law and how women were unequal under the law. They weren't allowed to enter professions, they weren't allowed to vote, they weren't allowed to do lots of different things. They weren't allowed to have their open a bank account on their own. So for first wave feminists, I think that women, that the focus of their activism, did they think it's very, very, I think Elsie was writing her memoirs in the 1970s, and she was very disdainful of second wave feminism and the bra burning that went on. So I think she would have been very critical of some of the discussions that are going on in feminism today, in the same way that maybe second wave feminists are also critical of the discussions going on in feminism today. I think it's very interesting to see, I was discussing this in my Viva, that whoever comes after you, you're kind of like, oh no, we did it far better back in my day, which yeah, so I don't think, whereas I think Chrystal, and again, this is me just kind of putting my own opinion on these historical people, so it might be completely wrong, was far more liberal in terms of her outlook. So I think maybe she would have been more in tune with the debates going on in feminism today.
I think that idea of how do you define a woman like legally in the past, it's a bit like animal rights and things like that. It's just, they're just sort of absent, aren't they, quite large from large parts of the law in the past, as I understand it. And it's just sort of assumed that they'll be treated benevolently by their guardian father, guardian husband, who has legal rights.
Yeah, I mean, you can see that in lesbianism was never actually illegal because they politicians were so afraid that they thought women didn't know about it. They thought if we say about it, we talk about it, they're going to know about it and they might want to do it. So we just won't ever mention lesbianism. It was very much a kind of a protective, especially for middle class women. They were very much raised in this very protective sphere.
Yeah, that phrase you mentioned about like women being in the home, and I always love that Virginia Woolf thing, you know, there's the angel in the house, and she wrote that article called Killing the Angel in the House is like the goal of like get rid of that idea of the domestic goddess, until Nigella Lawson brought it back and whatever. So it's, yeah, just get rid of that idea that you should be the saint in the house, and the man comes home from his weary day and you give him his slippers and his pipe and don't complain. That's you know, you've got to free yourself from that mindset first. And then you can start to free the world. So yeah, there's some more great comments in here for you. Leslie's mentioning that 2 women were thought to have died from Black Friday, and one of them's buried in Glasgow.
That's really interesting. I thought there was one. But...
lawmakers have all the power, make all the definitions. Did they think? I think you answered that one. Yeah. So the Wikipedia says that Emmeline Pankhurst said that they were terrorists.
Interesting, because there was this whole debate a couple of years ago about posthumous like pardon for women who were suffragettes, and a lot of people sort of said, well, isn't that taking away from their original intent was we want to break the law to protest, we are political protesters. So there's a really interesting debate on whether on that surrounding that whole question.
I find it amazing how like really radical people become establishment figures after a period of time. I think that's just really interesting too, and how they sort of like they have the rough edges knocked off and they become this sort of saintly figure. I think Churchill is a great example of that too. He was a very awkward figure and he's become this very two-dimensional figure that people have in their mind's eye, but also some of the suffragettes as well. Yeah, and male historians have a terrible tendency to ignore the possibility that women could be lesbians. Yeah, obviously.
There's a lot of close female friends which
yeah, absolutely. And then Carol saying that the angel in the house is based on Emily Augusta Patmore. Yeah, that's very interesting. Thank you for that.
Yes.
And,
sorry, I was just reading the comments and agreeing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the first hunger striking suffragette was a Scot, and whether or not she was a political prisoner or not. I had a question for you, Laura, which was, do you think they ever met?
I do. I found one occasion where they were on a platform together. There was this massive event in London. It was just before the 1928 Franchise Act, which made voting equal between men and women. And when I discovered that they were speaking on the same platform, I got a bit excited. I was very geeky historian excitement. And I think because feminism at the time was quite a small community, people knew each other, and there were these connections. They definitely knew of each other, whether or not, and there are links between organizations like Elsie donates to some of the organization Chrystal co-founds, and there are these interlinking things. I don't think they were close. I can't find any evidence of them ever socializing together, and perhaps that's because they were sort of ideologically quite far apart on their other views, but I think they definitely knew of each other.
Good. And I'm sure they'd be happy to know that you'd spent such a long time looking into them and sharing their stories with us tonight. And hopefully you've got other plans to share your research more widely as well through articles and things like that, because I'm sure they deserve to be more widely known.
Yes.
Excellent. Well, I think that seems to have drawn us to a very natural conclusion. Unless anyone else has anything else to say, that was an interesting discussion to have had. And I know Laura's put her email at the end there. If anyone wants to email her with further questions or comments, I'm sure she'll be happy to have those. So I just once again wanted to say thank you very much and congratulations. And we're pleased to have you on board the team at the Devil's Porridge, bringing those research skills to bear on the stories that we are sharing in HM Factory Greatness. So that's brilliant. So thank you very much.